Being able to vote is a privilege. Not everybody gets to vote in the world.
Asian Americans are the country's fastest growing ethnic group, but until recently, they haven't voted in large numbers. Now, they're finding their voices at the polls.
我们入了籍就会投票。
In America's battleground states, how will these voters choose?
Make America great again!
When I think about how I want more Asian Americans to participate in American political life, this is not what I had in mind.
This is a democratic process.
那么他到了这个地方，他会把他这个从来没有拥有过的权利给他放大，因为有人听了。
First vote on America Reframed.
Why is the book called Partly Colored? Is that an apt description for how Asian American subjects are seen as racially anomalous in the U.S. South?
If something is colored, it means to be tinged by some kind of other meaning.
Good.
Or like an off-white or some kind of departure from what is normal or what is the default.
I think when I thought of the title, I immediately kind of historicalized it and the way that in the South, they use the word color to refer to people of African American descent. And so when we're talking about partly colored, I saw that as like we're going from the white-black continuum and we're in between those two.
Yeah, I mean, and definitely to refer to people, especially in the U.S. South, as colored, that was a label used to describe people of African descent in the U.S. South during the time of Jim Crow and segregation. But this question of who counted as colored in the U.S. South, where did the Asian Americans sit on the segregated bus? Where did Lumbees fit within the kind of racial color line of the U.S. South? Yes, so I am Chinese American. My father is a refugee from mainland China, from communist China in the 1950s, and my mother is an immigrant from Kingston, Jamaica. Her parents, my maternal grandparents, were immigrants themselves from Hong Kong and then went to Jamaica. And I was filmed by Yi Chen, the filmmaker of First Vote, teaching a course called Asian Americans in the U.S. South. And in that course, I teach, or taught, I should say, I'm no longer at UNC Chapel Hill, so I probably am not going to teach that class again. But I routinely taught a book by Leslie Bow called Partly Colored, which is about racially ambiguous figures in the U.S. South, the majority of whom are Asian American, but she does have a chapter where she talks about the Lumbee Indians. So I think what's really important for me as a professor and as a teacher, and I think this is really true of every professor and educator that I know, we're not interested in being people who push ideas down our students' throats, right? We don't want to tell our students, this is how you should think, this is how you should vote. I want my students to be critical thinkers on their own right, and I want to teach them critical thinking. Now, as somebody who believes very much that every U.S. citizen should be invested in the democratic process of voting, then as a private citizen, what I would say is that I want every person to vote. And most especially, I think this is important for Asian Americans because of the way that Asian Americans have been disenfranchised in the United States. So for example, Asian Americans were in a very unique category of being labeled as aliens ineligible for citizenship. And it really wasn't until the mid-1940s that that was lifted. And that was lifted only first for Chinese Americans. Japanese Americans, it took them another few years to have that category taken off because of the way that the United States was treating Japanese Americans in the aftermath of World War II. So the fact that many Asian Americans who wanted to become naturalized citizens, who wanted to be able to exercise their right to vote, really couldn't because of racist laws that were on the books for so long, should be an impetus to all Asian Americans to really think about how there are generations of Asian Americans who didn't have the ability to vote. And I really think that we should think about that and we should exercise our right to vote now. Think about the US South and think about the people in the US South. So if you had three photos, right, a black person, a white person, and my photo, who are the two people that you would most associate? My photo is probably not going to come up. And that means that we have this normative idea of what it means to be in the US South. And we also have this normative idea about what it means to be American. I think I want people to know who Asian Americans are because there's so much misinformation. People don't know who Asian Americans are. Sounds so simple, but it's just true. Like, I think there's so much misunderstanding about who Asian Americans are, that we're foreign, we're not from here, or in the US South, it's that we're not people of color. We are honorary white people. What I talk about in the documentary are the ways that Asian Americans in the US South are misunderstood and are really not recognized as Asian Americans and as people of color. And so on more than one occasion, I was told by people who were not themselves Asian, who were white and who were black, that for all intents and purposes, Asians were white. Now, I think what people were trying to say to me is not that Asian people in the US South are somehow misunderstood or perceived to be white appearing, right? It's not that these people were saying that people in the US South cannot recognize racial difference and cannot recognize Asians as being optically of a different race than white people. What they were saying, though, is that because Asian Americans occupy an ambiguous place in the US South in terms of the racial color line, that it was more akin, Asians were more akin to having white privilege than they were being subjected to anti-Black racism. And to a certain extent, I think that's true in that I am not subject to anti-Black racism in the US South or anywhere else. Having said that, I think what is probably difficult for someone who is an Asian person in Asia, who'd be listening to me right now, understanding the concept of race and racialization that Asian Americans undergo. So for example, I think that the concept of Asian America is not one that travels well. It's one that really is only understood within the context of the United States or North America. That there is no such thing as an Asian American person in China. You just would have Chinese people. So the idea that somehow Chinese people have something in common with people from Japan, for example, when there have been historic conflicts between those two nations, is really foreign. It's only until you come to the United States that you undergo this process of racialization, whereby to an outsider who's neither Chinese nor Japanese, both East Asian people will be confused for one another and will be subject to the same racial slur that may not have anything to do with being either Japanese or Chinese, right? So during the war in Vietnam, and I don't want to say what that slur was, but there was a common slur that was used against Vietnamese people. And that would get leveled, that has been leveled at me, despite the fact that I am not Vietnamese American. So in other words, the person who's hurling racial slurs doesn't really care about ethnic particularity. They're just interested in enacting a racist slur in that very moment. So I know this is a very long-winded way of answering, but I think that it's, I think what people in the US South are trying to articulate is not sure where the alliances are with Asian Americans, right? They're not sure, are Asian Americans going to show up and support Black Americans and Latinx people and Indigenous people in the fight for social justice, or are they going to exercise some kind of white adjacent privilege and not become involved in issues that impact, especially the Black community in the US South?